From that time on, Jesus began to show the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. So, what I want to talk about today is what happens when things don't go the way you would like them to go. Because really we see an example of Peter who has that experience and Jesus who has the experience. Because Jesus is saying, this is what's going to happen. This is the mission that I have to fulfill. And Peter clearly doesn't want that. So it's a very interesting term. You don't hear in the common language rebuke. But in the Bible, that's kind of the way that they communicate when somebody is correcting somebody else in a somewhat of a, maybe a parental kind of mode. And we know that Peter loves Jesus, but he still feels somehow that he must rebuke him as though he's correcting him. No, that cannot happen. So Peter is not happy with what Jesus is saying. And then Jesus clearly is not happy with what Peter is saying, and essentially labels him as Satan, which would be really, really intense. I don't think we as a people know how to deal with when things don't go the way we want. Because if we did, I think that our planet would be a lot more peaceful. Primarily, how do we deal with this? I think we deal with it by force. And I don't think that's a wise approach. This is why you have a more male-dominated world, because typically men have more physical strength. And ultimately, that's sort of the final default. If somebody wants to control you and manage your behavior, if they are physically dominant in you, that becomes the default. That, to me, is barbaric and primitive. But we have not progressed much past that. Because if we did, we wouldn't need armies all over the world. What are armies there? Armies are there to defend our space in the event that an enemy enters into it. What people, I don't think, understand is that no matter what is being done to you, if you initiate a violent act towards somebody else, you initiate a karmic cycle. Because that act of physical violence is not an act of love. And therefore it's a violation against love, and there's consequences for that. At the same time, I understand that people can make an argument and say, well, if not for physical violence, who knows how far the Holocaust would have gone? They might have just continued. And I had shared with you recently that I read Nelson Mandela's book, and in that country, they spent 50 years, that was Nelson Mandela's number, trying to negotiate a way for the blacks and the whites to live in harmony. And after 50 years of a nonviolent approach, his assessment was nothing changed. There was a lot of lip service, meaning they said, well, we're going to look at that. Yes, we agree with that. But the minority government, because there were less white people there, did not make hardly any changes, if any. And then at certain points it got worse and worse. So that was the apartheid movement. So then he decided to go, okay, well, we're going to try violence because nonviolence hasn't worked. It was another 30 years before, there was some dramatic shift in resolution. So you could say, well, violence does ultimately work. Violence can achieve a certain means, but actually what led to the transformation in that country was, among other things, I'm sure, the energy of this one black man. I mean, it's inconsequential to me, the black and white, honestly, because spiritually, here was somebody who said, this is not right, that there's a whole sector of people that the government has deemed to be less than this other sector. And me being of somebody who identifies that other sector goes, that's not cool. What he didn't do was throw in their face everything that they did wrong in a spiteful way. He maintained a dignified relationship and was able to slowly win or reach the hearts and minds of those who were in a position to make the changes. Most of us don't have that patience. Most of us don't have that development. Because if something that we see is wrong, there's an immediate chemical change where the anger is just raging through us. And when the anger is raging through us, we don't think clearly. So we go, I must do something. And what do I typically want to do is inflict the suffering that is being inflicted onto the perpetrator. Is that human nature? I don't know. It's an instinctual response. I suppose you could see it in the animal kingdom. What does the animal kingdom lack that we have? Communication skills. Those of you who have seen a very famous movie from the 60s, Paul Newman's Cool Hand Luke. And there's a classic line in there, Cool Hand Luke. So Luke, who's played by Paul Newman, is in this, he's done some violence in the city, and he's been sent to this Texas chain gang. So they have to go out and work every day. And it's a very southern kind of feel, very Texan kind of feel. And the warden is this kind of, he's a little more sophisticated than a hillbilly, but he sits on his porch and he rocks and he has this really high voice. Luke, he says to him after trying to escape a couple times, he says, we have a failure to communicate. And that became a very iconic line from that movie. We as a people have a failure to communicate. I think the reason that line became iconic is because it's very true. Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison with a bunch of other people who were part of the ANC, and they were doing sabotaging acts against government property. They claimed they were trying not to hurt other people, they were just doing it. Occasionally people did get caught up. So he went to prison, and in the movies about it, you see how the jailers are quite vicious with them because they hate them. The white jailers are happy that they're going to spend their life in prison, and they want to make it as miserable as possible for these black freedom fighters. Which anybody watching the movie is, you feel that intense anger, the injustice of it. And yes, the human instinct is, I want to see that hateful man suffer. Nelson Mandela is able to maintain some sort of a composure. It's not to say he doesn't feel anger. But in his development, he realizes that the expression of anger does not move the situation to harmony. So he maintained a general respect to all the people, even who were disrespecting him. And eventually that led to the ability for him to meet with the white nationalist government. Then what did he do? Well, what he did was he listened. And they felt received. That is a huge skill. Because we have a tendency, when things don't go our way, to want to present our perspective and go, but this is right, and what you're saying is wrong. And when anybody calls you wrong, how do you respond? Generally, you get defensive. Because one's ego is embarrassed. We're not even at a point of realizing what is true and what is right and what is wrong, because those emotions get stirred up, and there's a sense of the ego does not want to lose respect, lose face, lose power. Which is why the spiritual path is very much about overcoming the temptation to act upon the impulses of the ego. Our planet is mostly driven by the impulses of the ego. I think. That's my experience. In order for it to be driven by the impulses of the soul, we have to teach people how to recognize the impulses of the soul. I believe one of the primary impulses of the soul is cooperation and harmony. If somebody who is acting on the impulses of the ego is creating a discrepancy in that, for me to then respond from the impulse of the ego and essentially meet them with violence, or what's another common? Well, I'm just going to withdraw. I'm not going to give anything to the relationship. I mean, I've been talking about, okay, a situation where you have political unrest, but let's bring it down to what we experience on a day-to-day level. When you have a conflict with somebody, and somebody does something that you don't agree with, where you feel disrespected, where you feel treated unfairly, where you feel neglected, where you feel taken advantage of, where you feel unheard, and on and on and on. That is something that I think, if you're honest, you experience that most days, maybe, at least once a week. That's because we as human beings are not particularly evolved when it comes to our relationships, I don't think. At least not at the level that I believe we can be. So to watch how you respond when you feel wronged shows you one aspect of where you are spiritually. And I believe you want to outgrow that temptation or that tendency to make situations worse. So you have to learn how to communicate. How do you reach the mind and the heart of the other people, the other individual? I mean, this can also be something that happens within yourself when you are at odds with something. And part of you knows, well, I should do this, but another part of you doesn't want to do it. So it becomes an internal struggle. How do you reach the part of you that is being stubborn and resistant? I think this is fascinating because the payoff is so huge. The payoff for us as individuals is a certain type of freedom. If you can be patient and you can learn the process, you will become skilled at reaching the hearts and minds of those who maybe have never been reached. And that moves the needle of humanity forward. So for those of you who are drawn to a life of service, that is a beautiful thing. At what cost? Well, in the case of Jesus, he gave his life for it. I mean, not only did he die on the cross, but what we understand is that he essentially just traveled around teaching and leading the apostles, and that was what his life was about. He gave his life to demonstrate what a life of service is like. And to a certain degree, you may feel called to do that. I think that there's really no other calling. It's just finding your particular cocktail, how you want to go about doing it. But the mystery again remains. How do I manage my emotional disruption, my anger, my desire for the right thing to happen, when I don't have the power to make it happen? I'm never going to advocate that you force it to happen. What Jesus does is very cool. He speaks the truth, and that word has power. Now, I have several incidents, many instances, in fact, where I feel, whether it's a bank or a retail company or something, you know, I have all sorts of agreements. You've got power company, you've got to pay their bill, and I've got order products from Lowe's for my business, and I got to have insurance. And these institutions at times do things that I don't think are right. Sometimes it's just a clerical error. They accidentally charge your account 2 times for this, whatever. Or they don't honor a particular claim because they say, well, you're outside of the parameters of what you agreed on. I don't think, and I try not to think, that this is all intentional, that they're all out there to rip you off. Maybe there are some people who go, well, if we get away with it, you know, good for us. But I try to have a vision of humanity as being better than that. At the same time, I know that when you call up customer service, in order to get things straightened out, you have to speak with conviction. You have to speak the truth, and you have to be strong about it, but not forceful. There's a big difference. So learning how to speak truth so that your word moves the mountain. And I've had that happen many times. And sometimes I've spoken the truth as best as I can, and they still say, no, we're not going to do it. So then what do you do? Well, there's another spiritual place that you have to retreat to, which is a place of acceptance. Maybe you're not quite ready to accept, and so you want to take another path. You want to write to the president of the company. And I've done things like that too, and that has moved the needle. And in one time, this is really the only time I've had a legal conflict with somebody. I hired a contractor for a house that I owned. This was probably a good 12 years ago. It wasn't going well. I had to fire him, and then we had to settle up how much money I still owed him, and we had a big disagreement. And so he put a lien against my house, and I acted upon the lien to take it up in court because I didn't want the thing sitting there. And this is something that I really respect about Nelson Mandela, is that he did not veer outside. I mean, yes, when he was younger, he did the sabotaging acts, and he was given a life sentence. But while he was in prison, and as he began to grow and mature, he began to do things the proper way. And eventually, it worked. So I do believe that we, the people, have set up systems by which we can resolve conflicts. Are they perfect? No. You may take up your situation in a court of law. I don't recommend it because it's very taxing. To be in conflict with somebody, you have to go to the courthouse and pay for lawyers, and then have lawyers argue in a way that's about technical details. It's not about the truth. And that's sometimes what you have to do. There are a lot of people who are fighting to get loved ones out of prison because they're 100% certain that their loved ones who are in prison did not commit the crimes that they did. Meanwhile, as they say, the wheels of justice turn slowly. You can look to the example of Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison until finally things changed. I don't believe most of us are going to have that kind of a price to it. But let's recap how I would suggest that you go about things in this order when you experience a situation where things don't go the way you would like them to. I think the most important thing is to identify the truth, which means you have to have a process to simmer the emotions down to a place where you can get objective sight on what actually happened. Oh, if only that was taught. You know, really. I mean, maybe that's a college level course. Maybe even high school students are too emotional to be able to do that. I don't know. I'm out of touch now. It's been a long time since I've been in that age group. But to teach somebody how to reach the truth within themselves, despite their opinions. I mean, you know, we have a movement of the social justice, and some of it is right on, and some of it is misguided by emotion. So how do we find that? Well, every individual has to decide, and this is my teaching, what happened? What is going on? What is the truth? Now, when you get to that, you could be humble and ask other people who you respect and go, am I seeing this right? I call that humility because we go, maybe my emotion is still clouding my judgment a bit. Then when we have gone, okay, I think I see it. What is my responsibility in this? That's the next piece. How have I contributed to this? That is a difficult pill for a lot of people to swallow. This is all internal. I'm not saying you have to publicize any of this, but even just to see it within yourself can create such an emotional reaction. To go, okay, so I see how I have contributed to this. My goal is to communicate to my wife, my boyfriend, my girl, my child, my teacher, my friend, whatever, whoever has caused me to have this disagreement, this angst, in a way that reaches them so that there may be a harmonious discussion that leads to a resolution that is satisfactory for both parties. And that is something that Nelson Mandela did, but it took a long time because he was essentially going, how you're treating us is wrong. And you kind of sense that they knew it, but they're like, well, if we flip the tables, they're going to take revenge on us. So in a sense, they're admitting we know it's wrong, but we can't just give you what you want, because then we're going to be vulnerable. You know, and if somebody didn't have their spirituality, they might go like, well, it kind of serves you right. You've been oppressing us for this long. As soon as you go into that mindset, like, I want to see you suffer as a result of what you did, you break from this spiritual consciousness. Is it tempting? Of course. How many movies are made where we get to see the bad guy go down? And there's a sense of satisfaction to that. That's a cultural moment in history where we still take tremendous glee when we see other human beings suffer because of the suffering that they have caused. I'm asking you to transcend that. If you do the work, you will get to a place where it's not joyful to see somebody suffer who caused suffering to others. So it's communicating in a way that reaches the other individual, or communicating to yourself in a way that reaches that part of you that wants to stubbornly see the revenge. Okay, this is hard spiritual stuff. Because on one level, you could hear this message from me, and then you go out and you watch YouTubes, and everybody's criticizing Joe Biden, everyone's criticizing Donald Trump. And the country is divided. It's like, if you're a Republican, you have to hate the Democrats, and you have to find every fault with them. If you're a Democrat, you have to find all the ridicule with Trump and their party. You know, we're all human beings on some level trying to figure out how to live together on the planet. We forget that. And this Fox Media does this, and CNBC does this, and it's like they're all taking their stance going, we know what the truth is, and they're wrong, and we're right. And I think you'll find the same thing is true within yourself. Until you go, okay, I want to find out what parts of me are doing this to other parts of me. So really, the guidance is to go within and begin to watch yourself as you unravel through conflict and go, I have a process. I guarantee you, if you've been on the planet more than 5 years, you have a process. You just may not be conscious of that process. So what you were talking about is the beginning of a consciousness of a process that leads to my emotional world. And when you take that on, it's like, it's very, very enlightening. That which was unseen will become seen to you. Your relationship to your emotional process. So start there and develop your ability to communicate within yourself, to win those parts of you over to love, to not allow them to barnacle themselves to hatred and revenge and self-righteousness. Even if you are right, learn how to communicate your message in a way that the other person may receive it.